Cruelty has a scent, and in a room filled with expensive perfume, it smells like cold iron. The businessman didn't say a word at first. He simply let his eyes travel slowly down Jordan's frame. He lingered on her simple gold name tag, then dropped his gaze to her comfortable, worn-out work shoes, shoes that carried the weight of a double shift and a hidden pregnancy. He let out a sharp, dry huff of air, a sound of pure, unadulterated dismissal. It was a small noise, easily lost beneath the melodic clinking of crystal stemware and the low hum of jazz, but for Jordan it was loud enough to turn the air to ice. The restaurant was a cathedral of glass and mahogany, perched on the 42nd floor where the city lights looked like fallen stars. It was a space meticulously designed to make ordinary people feel like intruders, but the man at table 12 took up space as if he had personally bought the oxygen in the room. He sat with an aggressive sprawl, one polished Italian loafer tapping a fast, rhythmic warning against the table leg. He didn't look like a diner, he looked like a predator, calculating the exact moment to strike. This was no ordinary difficult customer. This was a man who moved millions with a phone call and crushed lives with a nod. He sat there in a bespoke navy suit that seemed to absorb the ambient light, radiating a heavy, dark energy that made the nearby patrons whisper. Beside him, Soo-min Choi sat in a rigid, blazer-clad silence, her hand pressed against her mouth, as if trying to physically hold back the tension of the scene about to unfold. Standing before them, Jordan Wells tightened her grip on her notepad. She kept her back perfectly straight, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She knew what he saw, a tired waitress in a black vest. She knew what he didn't see, the Moretti crest engraved on the band of the ring hidden beneath her glove, and the heir to a throne growing inside her. The heavy glass doors of l'Eredità swung open, admitting a draft of cold city air that seemed to follow the man like a physical shroud. He didn't walk so much as invade, his presence cutting through the warm, garlic-scented atmosphere of the dining room. This was the businessman the staff had been warned about, a man whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by the depth of his pockets. Beside him, Soo-min Choi moved with a practiced, elegant stiffness, her eyes darting nervously toward the maitre d', as if anticipating a strike. As they were led toward the VIP section on the 42nd floor, a heavy, dark energy began to settle over the nearby tables. The soft clinking of silverware slowed, and the low hum of conversation dipped into a cautious hush. The man didn't wait for the chair to be pulled out for him. He claimed it, dropping into the velvet seat with a deliberate sprawl that signaled absolute ownership of the space. He tossed his leather gloves onto the white linen cloth with a dull thud, a sound that felt like a gauntlet being thrown down. From the periphery of the room, Jordan Wells watched them. She adjusted the hem of her black vest, her hand instinctively grazing the slight curve of her stomach beneath the fabric, a secret life she shielded from the world. She felt the shift in the room's temperature the moment he sat down. He was the kind of man who looked at a restaurant not as a place of service, but as a theater for his own dominance. He looked around the room with a squint of dissatisfaction, his gaze landing briefly on the ornate crystal chandelier before dropping to the table with a scowl. He didn't look at the menu, he looked at the air in front of him, waiting for the world to acknowledge his arrival. Soo-min sat opposite him, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned the color of the fine china. She was dressed in a sharp, professional black blazer, but her posture was a silent plea for invisibility. Jordan took a steadying breath, smoothing her apron. She could feel the bone-deep exhaustion of a 12-hour shift pulling at her muscles, but she forced her spine into a line of steel. She knew this type of predator. He was a man who fed on the hesitation of others, who searched for a crack in the mask of professional neutrality she had spent years perfecting. As she began her approach toward table 12, the businessman tilted his head, his dark hair catching the amber glow of the wall sconces. He didn't look at her face as she arrived. He looked at her name tag, his eyes narrowing as if he were cataloging a flaw in a piece of furniture. The air around the table felt thick and pressurized, the silence stretching uncomfortably long before a single word was spoken. He reached out a hand, 2 fingers extended in a sharp, dismissive motion that summoned her closer, his polished dress shoe already beginning that fast, irritated tapping against the mahogany table leg. The hunt had begun. Jordan moved through the dining room with the fluid, practiced grace of a woman who had spent years mastering the art of being seen without being noticed. To the elite patrons of l'Heredità, she was merely a silent gear in the restaurant's opulent machinery, as interchangeable as the silver spoons or the heavy linen napkins. None of them could see the bone-deep exhaustion that hummed beneath her skin, a relentless fatigue that came from 12 hours on her feet and the secret weight of the 5-month-old life growing inside her. Every step was a quiet battle against the ache in her lower back, yet she maintained her mask of professional neutrality with iron discipline. Her face remained a calm, unreadable surface, hiding the sharp intellect of a woman who had once studied international law and the fierce heart of a woman who had fallen in love with a king of the underworld. As she stepped into the kitchen to check on a ticket, she allowed herself one fleeting second of reality. She leaned against the cold stainless steel counter, her hand instinctively moving to the hidden curve of her belly. A soft, secret warmth flickered in her chest. Somewhere across this city, in a fortress of glass and steel, Alessandro Moretti, the man whose very name made the city's powerful tremble, was likely surrounded by his lieutenants, unaware that his wife was currently being looked down upon by a middle management bully. They had argued about this job. Alessandro had wanted to wrap her in silk and surround her with a small army of security to keep her in the gilded safety of their estate until the heir to the Moretti name was born. But Jordan had insisted on this small slice of independence. She wanted to remember who she was before she became a mafia queen, to feel the grit of the real world one last time. She had promised him she would be safe, that the world saw her as nothing more than an invisible waitress. Now, as she felt the heavy, dark energy radiating from table 12, she wondered if she had made a mistake. Reaching into her pocket, she felt the cool, hard edge of the heavy diamond band she had tucked away. It was a ring that cost more than the restaurant's entire wine cellar, a symbol of a marriage that could burn this entire room to the ground with a single phone call. She took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of expensive truffle oil and old money filling her lungs. She tucked her stray curls back into place and straightened her vest. The exhaustion was a heavy cloak, but her pride was a shield. She was Jordan Wells to the man at the table, a servant to be toyed with, but she was Jordan Moretti to the man who ruled the city. With her notepad held firmly, she stepped back out into the dining room. The businessman's polished shoe was still tapping that fast, irritated rhythm, a countdown to a confrontation he wasn't prepared for. Jordan didn't flinch. She walked toward the predator's table, carrying a secret power that made her far more dangerous than she appeared. To him, she was a broken toaster. To the rest of the world, she was a goddess in disguise. The businessman didn't look up as Jordan arrived at the table's edge. Instead, he reached out and flicked the edge of the heavy mahogany table with a manicured finger, causing the crystal water glasses to shiver. He let out a sharp, theatrical sigh of annoyance, his polished dress shoe continuing that relentless, rhythmic tapping. Beside him, So Min Choi's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening as she sensed the temperature in the room drop. "This is unacceptable," the man said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He finally turned his gaze to Jordan, his eyes raking over her uniform with a look of clinical disgust. I am paying for the finest dining experience in the city, yet I am expected to eat on a surface as unstable as a park bench." Jordan kept her expression neutral, though a sharp pang of fatigue shot through her lower back. "I apologize, sir. If there is an issue with the table, I can have the maitre d' move you to—" "I don't want to move," he snapped, the sound like a whip crack. He pointed a finger toward the floor. "The front left leg. It's uneven. Fix it." A heavy, expectant silence fell over the surrounding tables. Jordan felt the heat of a dozen stares, patrons who were too wealthy to intervene, but too curious to look away. She knew the table was perfectly level, the restaurant's maintenance was impeccable. This wasn't about the furniture. This was about the sight of a woman like her bowing to a man like him. The physical demand was a cruel gamble. Jordan felt the secret weight of her pregnancy, a protective instinct flaring in her chest as she considered the strain of crouching. But to refuse was to break the mask, to invite a scene that would surely end with the manager, Mr. Pringle, groveling at this man's feet while tossing Jordan to the wolves. Slowly, with a terrifying calmness that hid her inner turmoil, Jordan began to descend. She moved with deliberate care, her knees protesting as she lowered herself toward the plush carpet. Every inch of movement was a calculated risk for the life she carried, a silent prayer that the heir to the Moretti name wouldn't feel the sting of this petty malice. As she reached the floor, the businessman leaned over the edge of the table, his shadow falling over her like a dark shroud. "While you're down there, try to find some competence," he sneered, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "Or perhaps your kind is only suited for the floor." Jordan ignored the venom, her fingers brushing the cold wood of the table leg. She could feel the heavy, dark energy radiating from him, a toxic cloud that made the air feel thick. From her vantage point on the floor, the room looked different, vast, cold, and populated by giants who didn't care who they stepped on. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small wedge of linen, wedging it under the leg with a hand that didn't tremble. As she rose, moving slowly to protect her balance, she caught a glimpse of Somen's face. The woman looked physically ill, her posture a silent apology for a humiliation she was too terrified to stop. Jordan smoothed her apron and stood tall once more, her spine a line of unbreakable steel. She looked the businessman in the eye, her mask of professional neutrality uncracked, while beneath her glove, the Moretti diamonds set like fire against her skin. He thought he had brought her low, but he had only succeeded in ensuring that when the reckoning came, it would be absolute. The scent of panic was sharper than the aroma of the expensive reductions simmering in the kitchen. Mr. Pringle, the floor manager, appeared at the edge of the VIP section like a ghost summoned by the sound of a falling coin. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and nervous sweat, his tailored suit unable to hide the way his shoulders hunched in the presence of real power. He didn't look at Jordan. He didn't see the strain in her posture or the way her hand subtly shielded her midsection. His eyes were fixed entirely on the businessman's scowl, calculating the potential loss of a 5-figure tip. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Sterling?" Pringle asked, his voice oily and thin, lacking any of the steel Jordan had come to expect from men in leadership. He stepped into the heavy, dark energy of the table, his hands fluttering like trapped birds. The businessman didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes on Jordan, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Your staff is incompetent, Pringle. This girl seems to think she's doing me a favor by standing there, and the table was a disgrace. I had to watch her fumble around on the floor just to get a stable surface to eat on." Pringle turned to Jordan, and for the first time his gaze landed on her. There was no sympathy in his eyes, only a cold, desperate readiness to fold. To Pringle, Jordan wasn't a doctoral candidate, a wife, or a mother-to-be. She was a sacrificial lamb to be offered up to the altar of the restaurant's rating. "Jordan," he hissed, the mask of professional neutrality on his own face cracking to reveal the coward underneath. "What have you done to upset our most valued guest? Apologize, immediately." Jordan felt a surge of cold fire in her veins. She looked at Pringle, seeing the spinelessness that allowed men like Sterling to thrive. The manager was ready to sacrifice her dignity, her safety, and her job just to keep the wine flowing and the bills paid. He was a man who lived in the shadow of giants, never realizing that the woman he was about to berate was married to the tallest giant of them all. "I have apologized for the perceived instability of the table, Mr. Pringle," Jordan said, her voice a calm, low vibration that cut through Pringle's frantic energy. "And I have leveled it to the gentleman's satisfaction." "It's not to my satisfaction," roared Sterling, slamming his hand down on the now immovable table. The noise echoed through the cavernous room, drawing the eyes of every diner on the 42nd floor. "She's slow, she's disrespectful, and she's an eyesore in a place like this." Pringle winced as if he had been struck. He leaned in closer to Jordan, his breath smelling of stale coffee and anxiety. "One more word out of you that isn't a plea for forgiveness, and you can hand in your vest tonight. Do you understand? Mr. Sterling wants a perfect evening, and if you are the obstacle, I will remove you myself." Jordan stood her ground, the weight of the Moretti name a silent anchor in her soul. She saw the way Pringle's hands trembled, the way he was already preparing to throw her to the wolves to secure a high-status nod. He was a small man playing a small game, unaware that the air in the room was beginning to thin, and the true storm was only moments away from breaking over his head. Sterling watched the manager retreat with a satisfied, oily smirk, sensing that he had successfully stripped Jordan of her protection. He leaned back in the plush velvet chair, the heavy, dark energy around him thickening as he focused his full attention on her. Beside him, Sumin Choi had gone completely still, her gaze fixed on the mahogany table, as if she could disappear into the wood grain. Sterling's polished shoe slowed its tapping, replaced by a predatory stillness that was far more unnerving. "You know, Pringle is right about one thing," Sterling began, his voice dropping into a conversational tone that felt like a razor blade wrapped in silk. "You are an obstacle, but I don't think it's just incompetence. I think it's a lack of fundamental understanding of your place." He let the silence stretch, his eyes traveling once more from her face down to her server's vest. "Tell me, do they just pick anyone off the street now to serve at La Redita, or did you have to beg for the chance to breathe this air?" Jordan felt the first true spike of adrenaline hit her system, a cold heat that vied with the fatigue in her limbs. She tightened her grip on the silver order pen, her knuckles white. "I am here to ensure your dining experience is flawless, sir. Would you like to hear the specials, or should I start with the wine list?" Sterling let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "The wine list? You think you're qualified to speak about a vintage that costs more than your yearly rent? I doubt you can even pronounce the labels." He leaned forward, the smell of expensive bourbon and malice reaching her. "You have that look about you, that overqualified arrogance. But in this room, you're just a pair of hands, a pair of slow, tired hands that probably shouldn't be touching fine china at all." He leaned closer, his voice falling to a whisper that cut through the jazz like a serrated edge. He used a derogatory term, a slur aimed at her race that landed with the weight of a physical blow. It was a verbal trap, designed to shatter her mask of professional neutrality and provoke a reaction that would give Pringle the excuse to fire her on the spot. He wanted her to scream, to cry, or to walk away, anything that would prove his twisted theory that she didn't belong in his world. Jordan's breath hitched for a fraction of a second, her hand moving reflexively toward her stomach. The insult stung, but the secret power she carried was a cooling balm. She thought of Alessandro, who called her his queen, and of the Moretti name that carried more weight in this city than Sterling's entire portfolio. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze steady and terrifyingly calm. "The wine list, sir," she repeated, her voice as smooth as polished stone. Sterling's smirk faltered. He had expected her to break, but she stood before him like an unyielding statue. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a servant, but as a riddle he couldn't solve. The air between them hummed with a dangerous electric tension. He hadn't just insulted a waitress, he had challenged a woman who was currently carrying the legacy of the man who owned the very ground Sterling stood on. The trap was set, but he was the one walking blindly into the jaws of a lioness.
Sterling's eyes darkened, frustrated by the unyielding mask of professional neutrality Jordan continued to wear. He leaned back, a cruel, predatory glint replacing his initial shock. If he couldn't break her spirit with insults, he would break her competence. He reached out and snatched the leather-bound menu from the table, not to read it, but to use it as a prop in the theater of her impending failure. "Fine," he spat, the word dripping with a heavy, dark energy that seemed to dim the golden light of the dining room. "If you're so eager to serve, let's see if that tired brain can keep up." Without warning, he began to speak. It wasn't an order, it was a verbal assault. He launched into a rapid-fire sequence of demands, his voice a low, jagged blur that ignored the traditional structure of the menu. He ordered an obscure vintage of Barolo, demanding it be decanted at exactly 17 degrees, followed by a series of complex modifications to the evening's specials. He wanted the ossobuco, but with the marrow prepared in a style only found in a specific village in Lombardy, the risotto substituted with a grain the restaurant didn't even keep in the pantry, and a side of white truffles shaved to a transparency that would defy the light. He didn't pause for her to write. He spoke faster and faster, intentionality behind every syllable designed to create a maze of orders that would leave any seasoned server drowning. He peppered the monologue with technical culinary terms in a thick, mocking accent, watching her pen move across the notepad with a sneer. He was trying to catch her in a moment of hesitation, waiting for the "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" that would give him the opening to crush her for good. Beside him, Suman Choi looked as though she were witnessing a slow-motion car crash. She watched Jordan with a mixture of panic and embarrassment, her fingers twisting her napkin into a tight, white knot. Every patron within earshot had gone silent, the only sound in the VIP section being the frantic rhythmic tapping of Sterling's shoe and the staccato burst of his impossible demands. Jordan felt the bone-deep exhaustion flare in her legs, but her mind was a cold, sharp blade. She didn't ask him to slow down. She didn't flinch as he added a third and fourth course of contradictory requirements. She processed the information with the high-speed precision of the scholar she was, her East Asian linguistics training allowing her to deconstruct the cadence of his speech, even as she felt the child move within her, a subtle reminder of the life that mattered far more than this man's ego. Sterling finished with a sharp, triumphant exhale, leaning over the table to see the mess he assumed she had made of her notes. "Got all that? Or do I need to find someone who actually speaks the language of this establishment?" Jordan didn't look down at her pad. She clicked her pen shut with a deliberate snap that echoed in the sudden silence of the room. She met his gaze with a look of such absolute, icy composure that for a moment the businessman actually recoiled. The trap had been sprung, but as she opened her mouth to respond, it was clear that Sterling had no idea he was the one caught in the teeth. The silence that followed Sterling's verbal onslaught was thick, heavy with the expectation of Jordan's collapse. Pringle stood a few feet away, his face pale, already reaching for the termination of employment forms in his mind. But Jordan didn't tremble. She didn't look at her notes once. She stood with a spine of reinforced steel, her mask of professional neutrality transforming into something sharper, something that looked less like a servant's patience and more like a judge's verdict. She clicked her pen one final time, a deliberate snap that signaled the end of her silence. When she spoke, her voice wasn't the hushed tone of a waitress, it was a low, resonant chime of absolute authority. "The 2010 Reserva Barolo," she began, her eyes locked onto Sterling's with a terrifying calmness that made his smirk falter. "I shall ensure it is decanted at precisely 17 degrees to preserve the tannins, though you likely know that any higher would compromise the bouquet of dried rose and truffle you seem so eager to appreciate." She didn't stop. She moved through his impossible maze of orders with the precision of a master surgeon. "As for the osso buco, I will instruct the chef to prepare the marrow alla Milanese, traditional to the Lombardy region, served alongside a saffron-infused risotto, which, despite your concerns, we keep in-house specifically for guests with discerning, if somewhat specific, palates." Sterling's foot stopped tapping. The fast, irritated rhythm died as he stared up at her. He looked like a man who had thrown a punch at a ghost only to find it was made of solid granite. "Finally," Jordan continued, her voice gaining a melodic, commanding edge, "the white truffles will be shaved at the table to a thickness of 0.2 millimeters, transparent enough to defy the light, as you requested, yet substantial enough to command the price point your status requires." She paused, the weight of her intellect filling the space between them. "I have also noted your desire for the grain substitution. I will personally supervise the pantry selection to ensure the texture complements the marrow without overshadowing it. Is there anything else, Mr. Sterling, or shall I proceed to the cellar to find a vintage that matches the complexity of your character?" The air in the room seemed to rush back in all at once. Soo Min Choi's hand dropped from her mouth, her expression shifting from panic to a look of profound, stunned respect. The nearby diners, who had been holding their breath, began to whisper, the heavy, dark energy that Sterling had used to dominate the room now being systematically dismantled by the woman he had tried to break. Jordan stood her ground, her hand resting protectively over her stomach, feeling a kick of life that fueled her resolve. She wasn't just a pair of hands. She was a scholar, a wife, and a mother-to-be, and she had just turned the businessman's theater of humiliation into a classroom where he was the only student failing the grade. She didn't need to yell. Her competence was a gavel, and it had just fallen with a finality that left the predator speechless in his own velvet seat. Sterling's face transitioned from a pale shock to a mottled, violent purple. The heavy, dark energy that had been simmering around him finally boiled over, fueled by the sheer humiliation of being intellectually outclassed by someone he considered beneath his notice. He looked around the room, seeing the lingering stares of the other diners, and realized his reputation as a predator was being dismantled in real time. To save his bruised ego, he did what all small men do when faced with a superior force. He reached for the only weapon he had left: destruction. "Enough!" he roared, the sound echoing off the mahogany panels and causing a nearby server to drop a tray of silver. He shoved his chair back with a screech that set Jordan's teeth on edge. He didn't look at Jordan anymore. He looked past her, searching for the shadow of Mr. Pringle. "Pringle, get over here right now!" The manager appeared instantly, practically vibrating with a frantic, desperate energy. He looked at Sterling's enraged face, and then at Jordan's terrifying calmness, and he made his choice before a single word was spoken. This person, Sterling hissed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at Jordan's chest, has insulted me for the last time. I don't care about the wine. I don't care about the marrow. I want her gone. I want her fired, blacklisted, and escorted out of this building in handcuffs if I have to see her face for one more second. Mr. Sterling, please, I assure you, Pringle began, his voice a pathetic whine. Don't assure me, Sterling barked, leaning into Pringle's personal space. If she is still wearing that vest in 5 minutes, I will pull my firm's entire account from this establishment. I will make it my personal mission to see this restaurant shuttered by morning. Do you understand me? It's her or the business. Choose. Turning to Jordan, the mask of professional neutrality he usually wore had been replaced by a look of sheer, cold-blooded survival. He didn't see the woman who handled an impossible order with genius precision. He didn't see the fatigue in her eyes or the protective way she held her hand over her unborn child. He saw a liability. "Jordan, hand me your notepad," Pringle said, his voice trembling but firm. "You're done. Don't bother going to the locker room. Just leave. Now." Jordan felt a cold wave of stillness wash over her. The bone-deep exhaustion seemed to vanish, replaced by a crystalline clarity. She looked at the two men, one a bully, the other a coward, and realized they were both drowning in a shallow pool of their own making. Beside them, Su Min Choi looked down at the table, her eyes shimmering with a panic and embarrassment that was no longer for Jordan, but for the man she was with. "I haven't finished my shift, Mr. Pringle," Jordan said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. "Your shift ended the moment you decided to be clever," Sterling sneered, a triumphant, ugly grin returning to his face. "Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of. You're nothing in this city. You're invisible." Jordan didn't move. She felt a familiar vibration in the floor, a heavy, rhythmic pulse of footsteps that signaled the arrival of something far more substantial than a businessman's ego. The nuclear threat had been launched, but as the air in the room grew suddenly, impossibly cold, it was clear that Sterling had no idea he was standing at ground zero. He thought he had ended her career, never knowing he had just ended his own. The silence in the room was no longer just cold, it was lethal. Alessandro's hand remained anchored over Jordan's, his thumb tracing a slow, possessive circle over her knuckles. The gesture was so domestic, so profoundly intimate, that the math changed instantly for every soul in the VIP section. This wasn't a patron defending a server. This was a king reclaiming his queen. "You seem to have a great deal to say, Mr. Sterling," Alessandro said, his voice a low, melodic thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. He finally turned his head, his gaze landing on the businessman with the weight of a falling guillotine. "I believe I heard you mention something about a hole she crawled out of, and a termination?" Sterling's mouth worked soundlessly, his face a ghostly, translucent white. The arrogance that had sustained him all evening had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell. He looked at Alessandro, then at Jordan, his eyes darting to the way the Don's body instinctively shielded her. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't been insulting a waitress. He had been spit-shining his own coffin in front of the most dangerous man in the country. I didn't know, Don Moretti," Sterling stammered, his voice jumping an octave into a pathetic, thin whine. She didn't say. I thought she was just—" "You thought she was invisible," Alessandro interrupted, the words cutting through the air like a serrated blade. He stepped closer, the heavy, dark energy of his presence forcing Sterling to press his back against the velvet chair until the frame groaned. "This woman is not staff, Mr. Sterling. This is Jordan Moretti, my wife, the mother of my heir." The revelation rippled through the restaurant like a shockwave. Mr. Pringle made a soft, choking sound, his knees finally giving out as he gripped the edge of a nearby sideboard for support. The manager's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He had just attempted to fire the woman whose husband likely held the mortgage to his very soul. Jordan felt the heat of Alessandro's body, the bone-deep exhaustion replaced by a surge of quiet, settled validation. She didn't need to speak. The mask of professional neutrality had finally fallen, revealing the serene, dangerous beauty of a woman who was loved by a monster. "She wanted to work," Alessandro continued, his eyes never leaving Sterling. "She wanted to feel the grit of the world, and in return you made her crouch at your feet. You used slurs. You threatened her livelihood." Alessandro tilted his head, a ghost of a smile appearing that didn't reach his eyes. "Tell me, Sterling, what is the market value of my wife's dignity? Because I'm about to send you the bill." Sterling's polished dress shoe, once a tool of rhythmic intimidation, now shook uncontrollably. He looked at Su-Min Choi, but she had turned her face away, her panic and embarrassment now fully realized as she witnessed the total, systematic dismantling of the man beside her. The power dynamic hadn't just flipped, it had been incinerated. The man who owned the oxygen had just decided that Sterling didn't deserve to breathe it anymore. The heavy, dark energy that had radiated from Sterling all evening didn't just dissipate, it collapsed under the gravitational pull of Alessandro's days. At a single, microscopic nod from the Don, two men in charcoal suits, shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the restaurant's velvet curtains, stepped forward. They didn't touch Sterling, but they didn't have to. The mere proximity of Moretti's cleaners acted like a physical weight, forcing the businessman to stand on legs that had turned to water. Sterling's exit was a masterclass in silent humiliation. He was no longer the man who owned the oxygen. He was a trespasser being purged from a holy site. His polished dress shoe, which had drummed a rhythm of arrogance against the floorboards, now scuffed pathetically against the plush carpet. He looked toward the other tables, seeking a single sympathetic eye, but every elite patron suddenly found their wineglass or their steak incredibly fascinating. He was socially dead before he even reached the elevators. As he was ushered away, Su-Min Choi remained at the table for a heartbeat longer. She stood slowly, smoothing her black blazer with trembling fingers. The panic and embarrassment that had haunted her features all night had been replaced by a strange, fragile clarity. She looked at Pringle, who was still paralyzed by his own cowardice, and then she turned to Jordan. There were no words spoken, the air was still too thick for them. But as Su-Min passed Jordan, she paused. With a grace that felt like a silent rebellion against the man she had just arrived with, she reached out and placed a small, folded piece of paper on the edge of Jordan's silver tray. Her eyes met Jordan's for a fleeting second, a look of profound gratitude and sisterhood from one woman who had been trapped to another who had just broken the cage. It was a gesture that acknowledged the royal court dignity Jordan had maintained even while being ordered to the floor. With a final, respectful bow toward Alessandro, a gesture of recognition for the man who had actually protected his own, Su-Min walked away, her head held higher than it had been all night. Alessandro didn't look at the fleeing woman or the broken businessman. He kept his focus on Jordan, his hand still resting with proprietary warmth over her stomach. The silence in the VIP section was now respectful, a quiet sanctuary where the mask of professional neutrality was no longer required. "The car is downstairs,"
Alessandro murmured, his voice losing its jagged edge and softening into a low, private velvet. "You've had enough of the grit for one lifetime, Jordan. It's time to go home." Jordan looked at the silver order pad still tucked in her pocket, the one containing the maze of orders she had dismantled with her mind. She felt the child kick again, a strong, rhythmic pulse of life that seemed to agree. She didn't look at Pringle as she untied her apron, leaving it draped over the chair Sterling had defiled. She wasn't an invisible waitress anymore. She was a Moretti, and as she walked toward the doors on Alessandro's arm, she realized that the scent of cold iron had finally been replaced by the scent of home.
The heavy, floor-to-ceiling glass of the Moretti nursery offered a sweeping view of the city, but from this height, the skyscrapers looked like mere toys, and the people below were less than shadows. Jordan stood by the window, the soft morning light catching the deep, polished mahogany of the crib. She was no longer wearing worn-out work shoes or a polyester vest. Today, she was draped in silk the color of a midnight sea, the weight of the Moretti diamonds on her hand no longer a secret to be hidden under a glove. In her arms, she held the Moretti air, a sleeping bundle of warmth that represented the future of a dynasty. She felt a quiet, settled validation as she looked down at the infant's peaceful face. The bone-deep exhaustion of her months as a waitress had been replaced by a different kind of tired, the kind that came from late-night feedings and the heavy responsibility of being a matriarch, but it was a fatigue she wore like a badge of honor. On the desk nearby sat a tablet, its screen glowing with a news notification she had been expecting. The headline was clinical. Sterling and Associates files for Chapter 7 liquidation amidst fraud investigation. Beneath the text was a grainy photo of a man being led into a courthouse. Sterling looked haggard, his polished dress shoes scuffed and dusty, his eyes darting with the same panic and embarrassment he had once tried to inflict on her. He had learned too late that in a world of predators, it was the one you didn't see coming that posed the greatest threat. The door to the nursery opened with a silent, heavy click. Alessandro stepped in, his heavy, dark energy muted and softened the moment his eyes landed on his wife and child. He didn't need to speak. The way he moved toward her, his hand coming to rest on the small of her back, said everything. He was the man who had frozen the air in a restaurant to protect her, but here he was simply the man who had helped her build a sanctuary. Jordan thought back to that night on the 42nd floor, to the scent of cold iron and the sound of a sneer. She realized then that the humiliation hadn't been hers to carry. It had belonged to the men who thought a title or a bank account gave them the right to see through people. She had walked through the fire of their cruelty and emerged not just a survivor, but a victor. She looked out at the city once more, her reflection in the glass showing a woman who was no longer invisible. She had mastered the languages of the elite and the codes of the underworld, but the most important lesson she had learned was that true dignity was an internal fortress. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the room, the Moretti matriarch turned away from the window. She had shaped her own destiny, and as she laid her son in his cradle, she knew that the noise of the world could no longer reach them. She was home.